Well, kia ora koutou. Good afternoon from Auckland. I'm Murray Bruge. I'm the director of the Helen Clark Foundation. Welcome to today's webinar on global affairs with Phil Goff and Tim Groser. This webinar is open to everyone, and it's wonderful to have so many people interested in hearing from two of New Zealand's most experienced and insightful foreign and trade policy thinkers. We've got an exciting range of webinars planned in the coming weeks, including one on the Australia-New Zealand relationship with Helen and Phil's former colleague, Annette King, who was recently New Zealand's High Commissioner to Australia. Many of our coming webinars will be available to members of our foundation only, however. So if you'd like to hear more conversations like today's and to support the Helen Clark Foundation's mission of developing long-term solutions to New Zealand's key challenges, please do consider becoming a member. We try to keep our membership fees as low as we can. Annual membership is currently only $65 if you're waged and $35 if you're unwaged. So now is a great time to join, and you can do that on our website or via the link that my colleague Victoria will be posting in the chat. Also, many of you will have seen our foundation's recent report on social cohesion in New Zealand, led for us by the economist Shamibeel Yaqub. It's been very heartening to see so many New Zealanders interested in understanding and responding to this work, which reveals some pretty sobering insights about the state of social cohesion in New Zealand in 2025. If you're Auckland-based and missed our launch event in April, you'd be most welcome to see Shamibeel speaking about this work next Friday morning at 9 a.m. at an event hosted by EcoChoice Aotearoa. Foundation members can attend that event for the discounted rate of $10 by selecting the non-profit option on the booking website, which you can find a link for in the chat for today's webinar. So, to today's webinar. A quick reminder, this is not a normal Zoom call. As we always say, your cameras and microphones are deactivated and you're safe to eat your lunch without being seen or heard. We do hope you'll participate in the webinar, however, and the best way for you to do that is to submit questions for Phil and Tim by typing them into Zoom's Q&A function, and you can access that at the bottom of your screen. As I say, there is a separate chat function, and that's where you can find links to various things, but in terms of your questions for today's panelists, they should please go into the Q&A area. And finally, please do let us know what you thought of the webinar by filling in the feedback form that should appear in your browser or in your inbox. It's only 2 minutes, and it really helps us design webinars that you want to see. This is our second Global Affairs webinar of 2025, reflecting what is clearly a turbulent year in geopolitics. And to help us understand what's happening in the world and what it means for New Zealand, we're delighted to have two giants of New Zealand foreign and trade policy joining us today. Both Phil and Tim have been long-serving cabinet ministers charged with understanding New Zealand's relationships and advancing New Zealand's national interest. Phil Goff was Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Defence during much of Helen Clark's government and famously signed New Zealand's free trade agreement with China, the first such agreement China signed with an OECD country. Subsequently, he went on to serve 2 terms as Mayor of Auckland and also served as New Zealand's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. Tim Groser was Minister of Trade, Minister of Climate Change, and Associate Minister of Foreign Affairs during much of John Key's government during the period of 2008 to 2015, and was then appointed as New Zealand's ambassador to the United States, where he was briefly my boss. Prior to politics, Tim's track record as a trade official for New Zealand is too extensive to cover here, but highlights include stints as foreign policy advisor to Prime Ministers Muldoon and Longy. He was New Zealand's ambassador to the World Trade Organization and served in several senior roles at the WTO itself. So as a former foreign affairs official myself, both Phil and Tim were highly regarded by officials as effective and hardworking ministers, worked tirelessly while in office to advance New Zealand's national interests. So thank you both, Phil and Tim, for joining us today, and over to you, Helen.
Well, thank you, Murray, and greetings to everyone online. There's a lot of interest in today's webinar with 2 of our most experienced foreign policy and trade practitioners, as Murray has outlined. I go back a long way with both Phil and Tim. Phil and I met when we were in the Labour Youth Movement. I hate to say it, Phil, but more than half a century ago. and I was always aware of Tim as a personality around Wellington with many mutual friends, and got to know him better when I was PM and he was a senior trade person at that time, I think our trade ambassador in Geneva. We crossed paths, and then, of course, as minister, and also one in charge of the New Zealand climate negotiations, where he did a great job as well. So really a thrill to have you both on. Thank you so much. So we're going to run through some discussion points around tariffs and conflicts and policy directions and trends, and aim to open it up to the audience after around 35 minutes. So let's get into it then. And I'm going to perhaps direct to Tim first, because I know he's following extremely closely what is happening with what I call the ever-changing tariff regime of the United States administration. You think you're across it, and then you turn on the morning headlines and it's changed again, most recently on steel and aluminium. So Tim, and I think perhaps just give us a bit of a headline feel for what is going on and what might be ahead for New Zealand and other countries with this. We've been sort of minimally treated relative to others, but still no tariff is welcome. And where might this be heading in the longer term, including how other trading partners might react? So Tim, have a chew at this, and then I'll bring in Phil, putting on his former trade minister hat and also as an acute observer. Tim, come in.
Well, Helen, I think it's very sensible to split this up as you have into two time dimensions. What's the short and medium term outlook for us, and what specifically does this mean for New Zealand? And then the really, really intriguing questions about where's this actually going longer term in terms of the underlying rules-based system, which is, an intrinsically fascinating subject, but let's just stick to what the hell is going on now. And the paradox is that although this is policy instability on steroids, 6 different tariff regimes announced for China since inauguration in January, the situation for New Zealand is relatively stable. So for reasons that no doubt we'll find out in history, they decided just to slap on during this extraordinary decision of Liberation Day on the 2nd of April, a 10% tariff on New Zealand. Now, that is on top of existing tariffs. And that has not changed. So amidst all this turbulence, the situation facing New Zealand has been quite stable. Now, 10% tariff is the default, but there is a serious danger of this extending beyond just tiny, largely aluminium, I think, rather than steel exports to other products where they are applying what's called sectoral deals, which got high tariffs. So, but at the moment, it's 10%. And that is, as I said, on top of existing tariffs. So, for example, in our wine, we've got $600 million wine export industry, fantastic success in the US market. It's our largest export market. We got in the Uruguay round very, very low, what are called specific rate tariffs, basically, essentially nothing. And on top of that now, at 10%. Now, what I've said to companies here is, first of all, this doesn't really affect our competitive position in the US market vis-a-vis other exporters, because they're all facing at least that. What it does is alter the competitive balance between us and American competitors. And the other final thing I'd say before passing the ball back to you, Helen, is that this also creates a permissive environment for protectionism. And we need to be aware this is not the first time this has happened. If we take something like sheep meat or beef, there's a very powerful lobby in the United States lobbying for action against New Zealand on sheep meat exports. And they did impose a so-called safeguard in the 1990s on us. And I mean, they just see this as I said, creating permission space politically to take protectionist measures ludicrously disguised as national security. And if you, Helen, could explain why Australian and New Zealand lamb chops endanger the security of the United States, please do so.
Tim, do you think we're benefiting from being a little bit too small to notice? Because if, for example, the administration were to focus on the single purchaser arrangements in New Zealand and Australia for pharmaceuticals more, and acknowledging that Australia dealt with that in some way in its FTA back in the early 2000s, but potentially we could face demands around these issues or escalating tariffs and other things if we were noticed, but we're a bit small fry.
Precisely correct. And that has been in the back of my mind as a worry. I've 2 or 3 times negotiated on behalf of New Zealand governments, Labour and National, on Pharmac. It's the one thing that they, at least historically, didn't like. Pharmaceutical products are absolutely in the sights of this administration. So we'll just have to hope that we sneak under the radar screen because of our small size. But potentially, you're absolutely right. There is a potential problem and the government could come under pressure, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Thanks, Tim. Phil, bringing you in, any sort of reflections bouncing off Tim or other thoughts you've had on this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, what lies ahead is a really difficult question because we've got the most inconsistent and unpredictable president that I've seen in my lifetime, in my political lifetime in the United States. So he could do anything. He has been labelled within the United States as the taco president. Trump always chickens out. I'm not sure that helps us because that was obviously deeply hurtful to him, and he might strike back and continue with things against all evidence. But why it's so difficult? I read a very interesting piece by Thomas Friedman, a columnist, this morning, and what he basically said is that the decisions in the United States today are basically being made by one man who's done no homework, he's done no modelling, he hasn't sought evidence or advice for what he's doing, he has no congressional oversight because of the weakness of Congress, and he has no apparent reference to history. Now, that was a comment that got me into some trouble in London when I made it about him, but that reference is interesting because Trump, this is not the first time he's tried to put tariffs on. He put tariffs on steel and aluminium in his first administration, and it created, I think, some 6,000 extra jobs, according to the Wall Street Journal, in steel, but it cost 75,000 other jobs in manufacturing in the United States because there are more people that use steel in the United States than make it. So he doesn't learn anything. There are only 2 things that stop him. One, the markets, I guess, and the other are the courts. And we're still waiting to see whether the courts will intervene to stop him doing some of the ludicrous things that are happening. Will it hurt us? The 10%, well, things like beef, the Americans have a very low stock numbers in beef. They need their hamburger meat. Probably the cost of that will be met by the Americans rather than us. For some of our industries, if he puts higher tariffs on other countries than New Zealand, that might even help us. But where it damages us is in 2 things, and I'll finish on this. One, as Tim has pointed out, this is an attack on the rules-based system that we've depended upon since 1947 and the GATT agreement. So the rules-based system is something that a small country relies on. And the second thing is the damage that it does to international confidence and economic growth. And we saw the OECD yesterday lowering the predictions for growth this year because of Trump's unpredictability and his tariffs. Most of all, of course, in the United States, where the damage is going to be done. But if the world economy is doing badly, the old story of America sneezing and smaller countries catching pneumonia, that will be bad for us. So it's bad. We've got to look at alternative options, but it's hard when the United States is still the predominant economy in the world.
Yes, I mean, you both referred to the issue of international rules around trade. And, you think, for example, of the trilateral trade relationship between Canada, US, and Mexico. It's hard to see that the edicts of the US administration are in any way consistent with that. But then one also assumes that the tariffs policy as it's playing out in its many iterations, also rubs up against the GATT agreement from Uruguay, etc., etc. But with the WTO pellet system in effect in meltdown, the chances of getting any claim around the rightness or otherwise of this is pretty remote. Would I be right, Tim?
I think you're right, unfortunately. But the one positive thing I'd say is that the rest of the world, or rather the most important countries in the rest of the world, have not followed the United States down this track. So there is very strong resistance from Canada, Japan, the European Union, and other major economies. And I mean, they do at the end of the day, the United States, while it's 25% of world GDP, is, I say only in hyphenated commas, 13% of global trade. So 87 is non-US. And I think there's quite a fight coming by the rest of the world to try and preserve the key issues around stability of the rules-based system. But as you said, Helen, trying to do this without the United States is fearfully difficult. And, you know, there's some really interesting thinkers out there going way back to Kindleberger, but there have been recent other thinkers that say you only have a rules-based system if there is a hegemonic power there to enforce it. And can the rules-based system survive without that strong hegemonic power driving it and protecting it? Essentially, the US de facto started to leave the WTO under Obama when he, not Trump in his first presidency, when he blocked the appointment of the appellate body judges, leading in the long term to a situation where there is no possibility of getting any legal finding against the United States. It's called, I won't go into it, appealing to the void. But so, and there's an old phrase that I learned as a student of law so long ago, there is no law without a judge. There's a neater way of putting it, but you know, if you don't have a legal system overriding it, the law is meaningless.
And this touches on another key point, that since the era of Bill Clinton and George Bush Jr., neither Democrats nor Republicans have shown any great enthusiasm for opening up trade, right? So that's become almost a default bipartisan setting in the US. Do we draw that conclusion?
Well, I'll open up on this. There's never been a built-in majority in any Congress in the 20th century and the 21st century for free trade. If you read one of my close friends, Professor Doug Irwin, has written this magisterial book on this subject, and that's one of his central findings. So it depends on assembling brick by brick a coalition of people in the United States to support open trading systems. And the absolute paradox of this is that the last time this was attempted was in 2019 under the first Trump presidency, in which, having declared the existing agreement amongst the North American economies of Canada, United States, and Mexico as the worst trade agreement ever, then the renegotiated agreement, it was called USMCA in the United States, passed Congress with an astonishing 385 votes in favor and 41 against. I mean, you could put a resolution on motherhood and apple pie and fight to get a majority like that. So there's a sense of, going back to both your Phil's and your point, Helen, about extraordinarily unpredictability of the system. It's possible that if the political and economic guardrails start to close in on this, you know, we could see a reversion to a more reasonable position. And I think it really comes down to this. Are we prepared as a country, along with our close and many, many friends, prepared to say that's the end of the US commitment to a rules-based system or not? And I strongly say, no, we should not run to that conclusion, no matter how bleak it may look at the moment.
Don't give up now.
Yeah.
in effect, yeah. So let's then come to, the sort of broader Kiwi interests now. And as you rightly said, Tim, 87% of world trade is not the US. So there's a lot out there. And I mean, you and all of us really have been involved one way or another with the development of what became the CPTPP. You lose yourself in the numbers, but the Comprehensive and Progressive Trade Partnership in the Pacific. But there's key players in Asia which aren't in that, not least China, Indonesia, Korea, and the Philippines. Should we be putting a bit more emphasis on, enlarging the parties to this, noting that there's interest in this agreement now from far beyond the Asia-Pacific rim itself? And then while we're sort of discussing these prospects for where we might open up more advantageous trade, how about the FTA prospects with India? So there's a lot to unpack on that, but let's give it a go. I might bring in Phil first and then come back to Tim.
I was involved with the initial negotiation of the TPP with the USTR, the United States Trade Representative, Susan Swab at the time, and we had a huge breakthrough getting her agreement under the Bush administration for the United States to become involved. And she saw quite clearly that if the United States didn't get involved in the trading framework for Asia Pacific, then China increasingly was dominating that, and the United States would be frozen and left on the outside. We went for the TPP largely because the Doha round had been blocked, ironically, among others, by India. And while our preference is always for a multilateral trading agreement that brings everybody in and sets the rules across the whole of the globe, the next best thing is a plurilateral agreement. And the TPP offered some very powerful economies that having a trade agreement with would be really useful. We recently expanded at the time that I was in London to involve the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom brought in a very large economy, fifth largest economy in the world, 70 million people. And there's a big lineup of countries, including China, Taiwan, and others that would like to become part of it. I think we need increasingly to look at something like the CPTPP as a way of maintaining a rules-based system. If we can't get it globally, we can at least get it for those that are participants within it. And Indonesia has shown some interest in it. Korea, under the former president, had indicated some interest in it, where obviously it would be good to have others like the Philippines as part of it. But I think the CPTPP is one avenue that we go down. And to get new members, you have to meet two things. You have to meet the standards of the CPTPP, and secondly, you've got to have a consensus. So that's quite hard because there'll be some countries that will block other countries, but it does offer a way forward. And I think one thing that we're starting to look at, or that Foreign Affairs is starting to look at now, is whether there can be an involvement with the European Union, which would have sounded quite outlandish a couple of years ago, but in the current circumstances might make sense. With India, I mean, obviously it would be a great country to, with its large and growing economy, to have a free trade agreement with, but they've got an absolute block on some of our major exports like dairy, agriculture generally. We could possibly get an agreement with them. The UK has just finally succeeded after a long drawn out negotiation. It won't be a gold standard agreement, but it may be an agreement that works in our favour, and maybe we have to settle for that, as we did with the European Union. We didn't get all of the things that normally we would have wanted, but we got enough to make the agreement worthwhile. So we're being a little more pragmatic now, and setting the standard a little lower than at the time when I was part of the negotiations with the FTA with China, which was gold standard.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. Tim, if you had your Trade Minister's hat on right now, where would you be directing officials' attention in trying to, widen, our access to good quality trade agreements? Does it lie in opening up CPTPP, or where does it lie?
Well, I'd be following what I'm sure Todd McClay and his team are doing, which is multiple different targets. But let me just circle back to the underlying question here. I think we have to recognize that precisely because of the strong, consistent bipartisan support for trade agreements over 40 years, we've got a very impressive Plan B that's been built up piece by piece. Now, we didn't start down this track with CER anticipating the situation we have now, but the result is exactly that we have a whole network of trade agreements that they are not the first best, which would be full multilateral trade-based system, but they are a powerful insurance policy for this country. Now, as we have progressed, we've taken off the low-hanging fruit, as it were, politically. On the question of the principles behind this, then there are two different issues here. One is comprehensive and the other trade, in the sense of, should we go into trade agreements that exclude our major exports? The answer to that remains no. But it's not, we don't need full free trade to justify moving in this direction. And increasingly that's true because of the fact that we already have got these other agreements that are extremely powerful. So I think that as we add little bits and bobs to them, we're in a pretty good position.
Well, that is indeed the good news. I'm going to switch focus a little bit now, though there is a segue, and this is to the conflicts which are dominating media headlines, and I'll come to both Ukraine and the conflicts in the Middle East. Let me acknowledge immediately there are countless other conflicts which get very little media attention. It's called the CNN effect. Sudan's in crisis. Boko Haram still rampages in the Lake Chad Basin area. The Sahels had a series of military coups and ongoing Islamic militant insurgencies there. We have Somalia, elsewhere on the Horn. I mean, there are plenty of nightmares, to say nothing of Myanmar and our own not so distant Asia Pacific region. So a lot going on, but the ripple effects out of the Ukraine conflict, of course, came all the way to New Zealand with the pressures on food and fuel prices. And whenever there's conflict in the Middle East, that creates, again, uncertainty, etc. So but started on Ukraine. And again, I mean, this has been an incredibly volatile issue diplomatically this year. We know President Trump came in saying the war would never have started if he'd been president at the time and he was going to solve it on day one. Well, we're well past 100 days now, and it's not that easy, frankly. But Phil, where do you see this one going in the near term? Are we sort of fated to see this full summer fighting season cause more death and misery on all sides before we get any serious talking, if even then?
Yeah, regrettably, I think the answer to that is yes. I noticed that Trump had a conversation with Putin yesterday and said, there wasn't going to be any solution to this problem immediately. Both sides are pretty entrenched. Justice is on the side of one country, of course, which is Ukraine. It was Russia that breached the fundamental principle of the United Nations Charter by invading another country without good cause and committing terrible acts of destruction and death. But the terms that Russia is setting for a peace agreement with Ukraine are obviously utterly unacceptable to Ukraine. It says, well, the first thing you've got to do is have severe limits on your military. Well, why would Ukraine trust Russia after a peace agreement not to launch further attacks against it? Russia broke its agreement after the invasion of Crimea. It broke its agreement after Ukraine decided to remove all of its nuclear weapons, which were shipped to Russia. Russia is not to be trusted, and there's nobody in Europe and not many places around the world that would actually trust Russia to do that. Russia is also saying they want to keep all the territory they lay claim to, which is a fifth of the size of Ukraine. Well, how could any Ukrainian leader agree to that? Russia is saying there can be no Western security guarantee, peacekeepers within Europe, and of course, Ukraine could not be part of NATO. So Russia is setting conditions that are entirely lopsided, that are in favour of it maintaining what it's achieved by force and illegally, and I don't see them changing. The cost to both sides, of course, is enormous. I mean, the estimated casualties on Russia's side are a million killed and injured. I mean, that's huge. No other country in the world would tolerate that happening. But this goes back to Stalin's time, where life doesn't count for much and life will be given away easily. The Russian economy, 43% of its budget goes on defence, even more so in the case of Ukraine, and Ukraine's casualties are lower, but because they're only a third the size of Russia, they're much higher. So the cost is enormous. And the only path forward that I can see, Putin basically only understands hard power. And I think that the worst thing that happened with the Trump presidency was Trump immediately parroting the Kremlin's lines that Zelensky was the one that was the dictator, not he, Putin, who murders his political opponents, that Ukraine was the cause of the war. Well, everybody saw who invaded and who was invaded. And I've not yet seen Trump criticise Putin. Every now and again he says, oh, Putin's crazy and he won't do this. But basically, he changed the whole scenario of the Ukraine and NATO being able to rely on the United States to defend a country's territorial integrity, its sovereignty, its democracy, its freedom. So how could we change that? Well, if large countries like China and India were to put pressure on Russia, that might make some difference. Undoubtedly, Ukraine will have to make some concessions, but making concessions that threaten its future freedom and independence aren't on. The United Nations casts its votes overwhelmingly against Russia for its invasion. Ironically, last time the United States voted with North Korea and Russia against the United Nations resolution. Who would have believed that could happen? Voted against its democratic friends for North Korea and Russia. So I can't see it happening quickly. What I can say finally is that I believe that we should continue to stand alongside Ukraine. I met many of the soldiers from Ukraine that were training in the United Kingdom, being trained by Kiwis. And I was looking into the eyes of men who would be dead within 3 or 6 months. But they, according to our New Zealand troops, said these were the most motivated soldiers we have ever trained. They know what they're fighting for. They're committed to what they're fighting for. They believe in what they're fighting for. And Ukraine still has some surprises, such as its devastation of the strategic bombing fleet 2 days ago, where it launched drones from within Russia to wipe out 40 planes worth probably 12 billion New Zealand dollars. So you can't write Ukraine off, though undoubtedly Russia is making progress on the land war front.
Thank you, Phil. Tim, you've negotiated with Russia. I think famously you were on the brink of sealing some kind of trade agreement when they invaded Crimea and the Donbass, and it went to custard. But what's your observations on where this might play out now?
Well, I think there's only one plausible outcome, putting aside how we get there, and that is a frozen conflict along the lines of what happened in the partition of Germany or in the Koreas earlier. So the Ukrainians will never formally be able politically to cede legal sovereignty over Donbass and Crimea, and the Russians can be accommodated only by a de facto ceasefire, which is not of legal standing, but is politically there and enforced and, of course, protected. And as you said, Phil, there's no possibility either of Ukraine ever agreeing to essentially open the arms to another invasion by de-arming. So that's not going to happen either. So a frozen conflict is, I think, the overwhelmingly likely result. The question that we all have in our minds is, how on earth would we get there? Or do we just go through another vast, long period of attrition in which more and more young people die and some not so young people die on both sides? Now, I always remember that the greatest, most important analyst, Western analyst on Russia, George Kennan, the father of the Cold War theory, and the famous article he wrote in 1947 for Foreign Affairs, proposing it as an alternative to a hot war, said at the root of everything in Russia historically is a deep sense of insecurity. And I don't think that changes between the Tsar and Putin and all the intermediate people. There's a chilling similarity between the Cheka, the KGB, and the FSB to D. These are all brutal security systems that pretty much are one and the same thing. So that's not going to change. I don't see any realistic chance of internal political change in Russia in the next year or two. The one thing that I hope might happen is through China. And I mean, I'm just inventing this as a possible trigger, that at some point China might quietly work a way to persuade, perhaps if and when it's settled with the United States, there has to be some settlement with the president on trade. If there's some sort of linkage there to reaching some type of ceasefire in Ukraine, which I don't think the Chinese would be opposed if they're essentially moving in the right direction again with the United States. That might be a trigger, but I'm just speculating. I can't see anything internal in the process.
Yes, I've been of the view for quite some time that a frozen conflict is the best outcome that could be hoped for, and even that is very difficult, as you say. If it could freeze for as long as the Korean War armistice has, that would of course stop the killing and injuries and trauma and damage in every sense. But the question is how to get there. I agree that China should be seen as having a possible role in this. After all, they brokered a rapprochement to a certain degree between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which wasn't easy. So they have cards to play, but it needs a lot more diplomacy and interaction between the West and China on this than we've seen to date, unfortunately. Phil, bouncing back to you, I mean, the Middle East conflicts are ongoing, tragic, catastrophic. Any reflections and, thinking of, past peace agreements, the one between Egypt and Israel eventually saw New Zealand step into a multinational force that we've been there for decades now, playing a distinguished role and even from time to time heading it, as Major General Don McIver did in the past. But how do you see this developing in the coming months?
Well, I never thought that I'd actually get to the point where I would accuse Israel of genocide. I'd always had some sympathy for the plight of Jewish people over history, the oppression they suffered, the Nazi Holocaust against them. But sadly, the country of people who have suffered so much over history are now imposing that sort of suffering on other people. For fear of being accused of being anti-Semitic, which is the favorite tactic of Israeli authorities if you criticize what the government of Israel is doing, can I quote Ehud Olmert, the former Prime Minister of Israel that I met one time when I was Foreign Minister, and he said, the indiscriminate, limitless, cruel and criminal killing of civilians should not be happening, but it is, knowingly, evilly, maliciously, irresponsibly. That's what a former Israeli Prime Minister is saying about the party that he was once a leading member of and the country that he was once Prime Minister of. There's only one country in the world that can exercise proper constraint over Israel, and that's the United States. And far from trying to constrain what Israel is doing, it appears that Trump has both aided and abetted what Israel's the Israeli government's objective is, which is to make life so hopeless for people in Gaza that the only option for them would be to leave. And Trump talking about, of course, effectively deporting Palestinians out of Gaza. I think Libya was the latest idea he came up with, to turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East is frankly obscene. And we're not seeing it just in Gaza, but we're seeing on the West Bank actions by some of the extremist settlers, 700,000 of them illegally living in the West Bank, against unarmed Palestinian villages. So how can we change all of this? I was glad to see 23 countries, including New Zealand, condemn what Israel was doing, particularly the use of starvation as a weapon against the Palestinians, and that was great. It was great that we finally, after 2 months of Israel stopping all humanitarian supplies going into Gaza, actually took a stand and condemned it. But action is more important than words. And from the time that we were in government, we worked with like-minded countries. I think immediately of Ireland and Sweden. Ireland and Sweden are both now talking about the need to have economic sanctions against Israel. If they can persuade the EU of that, that's a third of Israel's trade. That would make Israel respond to stopping the starvation and stopping the endless killing, including of 17,000 children. I think the sanctions should go further. We have put sanctions against some of the extremist settlers on the West Bank, but the sanctions should also be against the political leadership of Israel, making life as difficult as possible for them. But does Trump agree with that? No, the sanctions that he is imposing are not on the people that have been found to have had reasonable grounds for being war criminals, but against the judges on the International Criminal Court that made that finding, punishing them for finding that some of the Israeli leaders were guilty of war crimes. So without the United States, much harder, but the rest of the world, I think, has an obligation to do something about the maiming, the injuring, the killing of innocent civilians, mainly women and children, and to stop Israel using tactics of collective punishment and starvation. It has to happen.
Also to be noted is they've blocked the UN agencies now bringing aid in and have mandated a quote US foundation to do it. And we've seen these terrible scenes of people making their way to the limited area for food distribution and ending up being shot for their pains. So yeah, not a happy scene at all at the moment. I think I should go to questions because we've got lots of them and some really interesting angles. There's one here from Leonora Faulkner, who says, in a time when trade policy is increasingly about power rather than rules, should New Zealand be rethinking how it defines success in trade negotiations? Instead of just market access wins, should we measure our influence in shaping the architecture of global trade itself? Digital standards, AI governance, carbon border adjustments, even if it means punching above our weight in complex plurilateral negotiations like CPTPP or WTO e-commerce. How can we build influence here? Tim, over to you.
Well, I think that's precisely what successive governments have done. It's never been just a market access negotiation. We've always tried to look at those legal frameworks and reinforcing the system, because for a country of 5 million people with very, very little hard power, the power that we can exercise is all soft power. And I think that has guided a great deal of what New Zealand historically has done. And to give credit to a number of different New Zealanders, not just you two, but others who've played their role over the years, that has been recognized internationally. There are many comments I've heard, and not about me, but about New Zealand's huge contribution on strategic trade policy. And that's so, I think the questioner is 100% right, but I'd simply say we have been doing this very consistently.
Any observation, Phil, on that?
Yeah, I think Tim's right. In the the latest free trade agreement with the United Kingdom, for example, environmental standards are very much part of that. Obviously, market access is critically important. We want a trade agreement so we can sell our goods without unfair, unjustifiable trade barriers, so that we can survive and thrive economically. But it would be wrong to say that that was the only thing. Ironically, with the environmental standards we've put in, New Zealand has committed itself to meeting the requirements of the Paris Agreement on climate change. Currently, we're not meeting that, and that could be that under the free trade agreement allows not only the United Kingdom but also with the parallel agreement with the European Union to use sanctions against our agricultural products if we're not taking climate change seriously. That's something that I think our government, our current government, needs to look quite closely at because we're falling well short of being able to meet by 2030 the undertakings that we have made in terms of reducing our carbon emissions.
Now, I see my former UNDP colleague Murali coming in with a question around the issue of how do we uphold international law and order with the UN as the guardian of that through its many aspects. The UN system is comprehensive and actually includes the WTO. The panelists have any observations on the crisis the UN is in this its 80th year? Of course, facing massive funding cuts, largely the Security Council unable to resolve anything much with the polarization. Any observations on where the UN is at?
Well, Helen, I think you should answer your own question.
I probably
You're by far the best placed New Zealander to answer that question.
Yeah, and my answer would be that the UN system is facing huge financing cuts. It's the member states over the years have been very good at setting up more organisations, all with their own overheads and structures. It is a time for rationalisation, but that is extremely hard. It's agony hour right through the system at the moment, and I do think it calls for also more voice, if you like, from the Secretary General. The UN's voice hasn't been, other than calling for humanitarian relief and ceasefires, it hasn't been an active actor in trying to broker a conflict resolution in some of the major conflicts. So it's got a lot of questions to answer for itself in the complex multilateral setting. Phil, you've been a UN observer a long time. Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, look, as a small country, New Zealand has always relied on a rules-based international system. And, you know, when our parents' generation came back from the Second World War, it was with a sense of optimism that we had replaced a system that existed previously where might ruled and there were no constraints on large and powerful countries doing what they wanted in the world, with a system where we had a charter that everybody agreed to, signed up to, we had human rights agreements, etc. Your predecessor, Peter Fraser, had a proud role in doing that, and we opposed the veto, for example, at the post-war conference that set up the United Nations. But the truth of the matter is that superpowers today still are able to do what they want to do, and the multilateral organisation that we rely on, the United Nations, haven't been able to stop them. It's obviously been challenged by Russia. I mentioned, you know, the fundamental breach of the Charter in invading Ukraine. It's ignored now by the United States, which was once a backer of the rules-based system and one of the originators of it. And China, as it gets more powerful, has shown an ability to disregard some of the multinational conventions and rules as well. What can we do? Again, I go back to the fact if we stand alongside like-minded countries, and there are many like-minded countries around the world, we need to act collectively to continue to push both for reform of the United Nations, but for the rule of law internationally, because the alternative, whether it's trade or whether it's foreign policy, is that the powerful prevail, justice, fairness, and all of the other things that we believe in go out the door. It's an uphill battle, but it's a battle that we've got to continue fighting.
Mm. Alison Payne has raised the prospects for a trade agreement with India, which we probably skated over a little bit earlier. I mean, I guess my assessment would be that perhaps it's more likely than in the past there'll be some kind of agreement, but probably nowhere near the gold standard, to put it mildly. Tim, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, both Phil and I tried very hard to move this item on the dossier through without success. I think this situation inherently is a little more favorable now. And while I don't believe for a minute, given the size, I mean, India is the world's largest milk producer. And the statistic that I've always remembered and used politically is that the state of Punjab and New Zealand produce the same amount of milk, basically, except that we do it with about 9,000 farmers, and the Punjab, not the Punjab, I'm sorry, the biggest state in India, which is Uttar Pradesh. They do it with 2.2 million dairy farmers, i.e. peasant farming. So there's no way you can expect them to, at this stage of their development process, open up fully to the competitive challenge of New Zealand. But we do not need anything approaching complete access. If we can get some niche areas in the more sophisticated ingredients market of India, aimed at the hotels, aimed at the high-end market, we will not be threatening the peasant farmer. And I'm hopeful that we will actually get something. And to repeat my earlier point, precisely because of the past success has given us a whole range of options we never had in the 1970s. We don't actually need complete bloody access to the Indian market for it to be worth a lot to us, because we've got a whole lot of other options. And my final comment is, I've been having this long argument with one or two of our most important New Zealand officials, all of whom I work with, of course. My theory is that the UK-New Zealand FTA is underrated for its importance. I mean, after all, our entire economy was set up originally economically as an offshore farm for Britain. And we have got an alternative market coming in over the long term that could become extremely important if things go really sour in, say, China or elsewhere. So I think the deal with the UK is actually, I've even argued it's more important to us than the deal with the EU, honestly. But
Yeah.
I've got detractors who don't agree with me.
No, I'm inclined to agree with you, Tim. And where I'll bring Phil in is, obviously we're watching how Keir Starmer's government is repositioning towards the EU and trying to get more constructive relationship again and better access. I have in my mind that when I used to visit the UK as New Zealand Prime Minister, there were Kiwi companies who located in the United Kingdom because of the ease of access to Europe, and Brexit, of course, put paid to that. Do you see, Phil, any sort of bright lights on that horizon, that the moves that Keir Starmer's government is making might also be helpful to us?
Yeah, I think they will. And to back up the point that Tim was making, the free trade agreement that we have with the United Kingdom has been very effective. I mean, before this agreement, basically, we were sending almost nothing by way of dairy or beef to the United Kingdom. There had been a massive uptick in both of those areas, once of which, were our major market for those products. But interestingly, our biggest export growth has been in the area of technology, which most people don't actually appreciate. So we shouldn't underrate that. I think Starmer is doing the right thing in trying to re-establish a relationship with the EU. It is by far the United Kingdom's largest market. When people look back at history and say, what was the economic impact of Brexit on the United Kingdom, they will agree overwhelmingly that it has been negative. They have to re-establish a market that is the closest market to them, a wealthy market, a large market, and a reliable market. They didn't reimpose tariffs with Brexit, but there are other barriers. And the UK would be insane not to focus on that market, particularly with the unreliability of the United States. And even though they've got a trade agreement with the United States, most people who look at the fine detail of that say that that's nowhere near a quality that will make a huge difference. And, you know, through the United Kingdom, United Kingdom was a great voice for us in Europe. It's leaving Europe, left us without that voice, but notwithstanding that, we have got a free trade agreement and a good relationship with Europe that I think we should continue to build on.
I'm going to, I know we're coming towards the end, so I'm going to put a question to both of you. In the area of trade policy, for the most part, for decades, we've had strong bipartisanship between Labor and National. Foreign policy and defence, we sometimes one side moves ahead one way or the other, but certainly on the nuclear policy in the end, there was no distinction. Do you think, though, that with recent developments, the bipartisanship on foreign policy and defence is under significant strain again, and how will this play out? Perhaps throw to you, Phil, and then back to Tim.
Yeah, look, I think where you can achieve it, bipartisanship in outward-facing portfolios like trade, defence and foreign affairs is important. If a country can speak with one voice, its policy is consistent, it doesn't change from election to the next election, then what it says and does internationally is listened to more carefully. I think in trade, by and large, that bipartisanship continues. We had a brief period where Labor, for reasons best known to people other than myself, didn't go along with the TPP. The only time in my political life, 32 years in Parliament, I crossed the floor to vote against my own party. But Labor came back and basically did what I believed that it needed to do when it was in government. Defence, both parties are saying, look, in the uncertain and turbulent world of today, hard power does matter, and we can't leave our defence expenditure at below 1%. Unfortunately, the United Kingdom and Australia and Canada, but mostly Australia and the United Kingdom, used to ask me about that when I was in the High Commissioner's role and laugh openly that how were we serious about backing up what we believed in the world if we weren't prepared to invest to a greater degree in hard power. The area of foreign policy, I think there have always been differences. You'll remember most clearly with the nuclear-free policy, which National was against, and the famous gone by lunchtime secretive quote from Brash to American senators. But National fell in behind Labor because that's what New Zealanders wanted. I think by and large New Zealanders are liberally minded in international affairs. And I think New Zealand should use its status as a small but determined country that's put the lives of its people on the line in wars and that has argued strongly in the United Nations for what is right and what is decent, should continue to work together to achieve those things wherever possible. But there will always be some disagreements that we won't find common ground on between those two large parties.
Tim, your thoughts?
Well, the very first thing that John Key did when he replaced Don Brash was ask me to write a document that everyone's now forgotten about, of course, called the External Strategies document on foreign affairs, defence, trade. And I also identified climate change in that document I wrote in that year he became the leader of the opposition. And in that document, the new National Party leader endorsed an independent foreign policy. Now, I deliberately, when I wrote that, I wrote 95% of it, did not seek to define what that really means. But I think, we have got a very strong and successful record of having a very solid body of consensus between our key two parties, the centre-left party of the Labour Party and the centre-right party of the National Party. And from time to time, it gets pulled under pressure. I will never forget a conversation I had with you. I hope you don't mind me saying this in public, Helen. Phil's right, he started a conversation with Susan Schwab, but that was about joining, i.e. taking over, P4. And P4 was started by us starting an FTA with Singapore. And it was quite conscious in the strategy paper that I wrote for the government of the day, envisaged this as the nodal point of a eventually US-led subgrouping of the APEC countries. And you came up to me weeks after you had just been elected Prime Minister and said, I'm under a lot of pressure here, which you were because of the alliance adopting, very typical anti-trade from, let's say it, the far left. And you made a decision that you were going to face that down. I remember that conversation with you in the margins of a cocktail party for a play called The Great Dr. Yabuhara, if that rings.
Yes.
So, and I look forward to saying this in public to give you credit for it, because that you could have easily taken the soft solution out, and we would be in a much worse position today had you done so. So that's a concrete example. I've given you two of bipartisan policy, but also containing elements of some flexibility here and there. You can't have a rigid, formal, forever set of agreements because the context changes from time to time. And I would just end by recalling, I think, a very lovely metaphor of Owen Glenn on this issue, which I think is beautiful in many respects. He said, from time to time, the waka needs to be rowed a little more strongly from the left, and at other times, a little more strongly from the right-hand side of the waka. Otherwise, we would just go round in circles. And I find that a very Aotearoa-centric metaphor that is a real-world view of this issue.
Well, I remember the Singapore FTA issue very well, because it was where the alliance first invoked the agree to disagree provision under the coalition agreement. And prior to that coalition agreement, if someone in a cabinet disagreed with the government decision, the whole thing fell apart. And the coalition agreement was written precisely to accommodate such a situation. And we reached across the aisle to the National Party for that agreement and for the votes on it. And of course, from that, as you say, came the P4, Chile, New Zealand, Brunei, Singapore. So lots of history there. Terrific conversation. Thank you both, Chris and Tim, Phil and Tim, for coming on. It's really appreciated. And Murray, shall I throw back to you just to wrap us up now?
Thanks, Helen. That's it for today's webinar. Thanks very much to our panelists, Tim Groser and Phil Goff, for making the time to join us for a wide-ranging discussion today. If you're not already a member of our foundation, please consider becoming one at helenclark.foundation. We'd love to have your support. And as I say, we've got a range of exciting webinars like this one in the works in the coming weeks that you'll be able to join. So thank you all very much for watching today's webinar, and farewell for now from Helen, me, and the foundation team.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.